Hi everyone, and welcome to our first training video in our next part of our series in Matthew's Gospel, King Jesus, the Call of the King. Tim here. A reminder, you're probably watching this after the training event, but if not, 1st of May from 9 o'clock is our leaders training event with Bradley Trout, who will be giving us a quick survey of this section of Matthew's Gospel. As we come to this next section to help us to find our feet, I've just put a little outline of the structure of Matthew's Gospel. You will remember that Matthew's Gospel is structured into 5 different discourses, and before each discourse comes a section of a narrative or action. And so at the end of 2019, we looked at the Christmas story in Matthew, which led up to Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, which we did in the first term of last year. Now we get to turn to Matthew chapter 8 to chapter 10, which is the narrative that leads up to Jesus' discourse in Matthew 10, where he sends out the 12 disciples. That's the section that we're going to be looking at this term, and next term we're going to be moving on to the next section of Matthew. We'll return to the final 2 sections and to Matthew's Passion Discourse in chapter 26 to 28 over the next couple of years. Let's zoom in a little and locate ourselves in chapter 8, where we start. You may remember that in Matthew 4 verse 23 we got a summary of Jesus' ministry, which involved the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness among the people. Well, coming up in Matthew 9 verse 35 we get a very similar summary of Jesus' ministry. And if we see Matthew 5 to 7, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom, and having gone through that series, you'll see and realize that's a very apt description for the Sermon on the Mount. This next section of Matthew shows that other side of his ministry, that healing of every disease and sickness among the people. And as we look at these narratives of healing, it's worth bearing 2 key themes in mind. And that is, first, Jesus' identity as the Messiah. And here we are thinking specifically as the promised rescuer for Israel, the king that was promised to David in 2 Samuel 7. And we're thinking about all the expectations that come with this Messiah, which are formulated throughout the Old Testament. A great example of this is Isaiah 35 verses 5 and 6, where it talks about opening up the eyes of the blind. And we're going to see Matthew return to that theme a little bit later on in our series. The second key theme is that of Jesus, Emmanuel, which was introduced in our Advent series. Emmanuel, of course, meaning God with us. And this is a particularly important theme for this specific study in Matthew and for other studies. We are reminded that God's presence was especially present in the Garden of Eden, but after the fall, humans were exiled from that presence in Genesis 3. And in a way, the whole Bible story is a discussion of how can that relationship between God and humanity be restored. And in the Old Testament and in Israel's story, we see that access being restored under very particular, unique, special conditions. We see with the tabernacle and with the temple special ritual conditions revolving around cleanliness, which allow the Israelites to enter into the place where God's presence was, especially in the tabernacle or temple. And so now, as we come to this concept of Jesus being Emmanuel, God with us, the question is, under what conditions can people approach Jesus, and how can God with us approach us in our uncleanness? Here's a quick look at where we're going in chapter 8 and chapter 9. These are the healings, so this aspect of Jesus' ministry. There are 9 of them in total, and they are grouped in 3s. And so in study 1, we're going to be looking at the first of these 3, the healing of a leper, a centurion servant, and Peter's mother-in-law, and a whole crowd in one scene. The next grouping is going to be done over 2 different studies, which will give us a chance to dig in a little bit more to some of the discussion and teaching around these healings. And then in study 5, we'll look at the last set of 3 together. Okay, finally, let's have a look in more detail at our study, the kingdom in action, God with us, Matthew 8 verses 1 to 17. And the aim of this story, our particular focus, is looking at Jesus, God with us, and the way that he's able and willing to reach out and bring into his kingdom those who should be unable to enter it. And so for this study, the important thing is to be thinking in our minds the whole time, well, what does it mean for God with us to be doing this or to be doing that? What does it say about him? What does it say about us? And what we're going to find is it's going to give us an enormous reason for joy that God would actually reach out to us, unclean people, and invite us into his kingdom. Here is a brief outline. It's a pretty simple structure. We've got Jesus healing a leper, then he heals a centurion servant, and then sort of together he heals Peter's mother-in-law, and then he heals a whole crowd immediately after that. And what we're going to see is these three and a half different stories are working together to re-emphasize and make the same point about God with us coming into our world and reaching out into our own uncleanness, taking it onto himself and making us clean. In this first story of verses 1 to 4, we meet a leper, and this leper kneels before Jesus, and notice the question that he's asking. He says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Two things to notice here. The leper knows his problem. His problem is that he's unclean. This is a ritual state. So we're not necessarily talking about a spiritual state here, but we're talking about a ritual state. And the context and background for this you can find in Leviticus 13, which means that the leper is unable to enter the temple, the place of God's presence. And so while it might not necessarily be a spiritual obstacle, it is a ritual obstacle to his relationship with God. And that's the problem that he presents before Jesus. And notice also the question that he asks Jesus. He doesn't ask Jesus a question of ability. So it's not, can you heal me, Lord Jesus? He asks, are you willing? So he believes that Jesus is able to. The question is Jesus willing to? And notice in verse 3 the remarkable thing. Jesus reaches out his hand and he touches the man, which is a key motif in the upcoming miracles, but made all the more surprising considering this man is unclean. And according to Levitical law, touching this man should make Jesus unclean too. But instead, what happens? The man is cleansed. Jesus, instead of being made unclean, his touch makes the leper clean. And now the leper is able to present himself before the priest, offer the gift of Moses. He has access to God again. In verses 5 to 13, we move on to another story, this time involving a centurion, so someone who is not part of God's chosen people, Israel. And his request, he says, Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. So notice there's a power imbalance here, and you'd expect the power imbalance to be a centurion, an exceptionally important military official, versus a common Jewish man. But actually, the power imbalance is in Jesus' favor. Notice the way that the centurion addresses Jesus as Lord. And then notice again in verse 8 how the centurion replies, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. The centurion realizes that in front of him he has someone far more significant than he is himself. And there's more to it than just that. You can look at Acts 10 verse 28 for this context. But for a Gentile to come into the home of a Jew was to bring uncleanliness into that household. And so there's a tradition of avoiding Gentiles, or at least not allowing Gentiles into your home. You'll notice this also in the Passion narrative, where the Jewish officials send Jesus into Pilate's home but won't go in themselves. And so the centurion, not wanting to make Jesus unclean, actually asks Jesus to heal his servant from a distance. And notice his reasoning in verse 9. His reasoning is that he is a man under authority, the centurion, and he is able to do things from a distance. He's able to order a soldier to go or come. And so he reckons that given that Jesus has a greater authority, Jesus can do the same and more with his healing of the servant. And notice Jesus' response and what he decides to do with this request. He uses it to make a teaching point about faith. And he says that this small instance of the Gentile is an example of a much greater picture, where many will come from the east and from the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But, on the other hand, there are those who would consider themselves to be subjects of the kingdom, who will be thrown outside. And so this is a challenge for us, that those on the outside will come inside, but similarly those who consider themselves inside might one day be thrown outside. And Jesus uses this story to make that point. And in verse 13, a man of authority, he gives the order, and the servant is healed. In verses 14 and 15, we get our third miracle, which is Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, who's lying in bed with a fever. And now this might seem like a somewhat strange story, other than the fact that it happened. But there were other non-biblical Jewish traditions around both touching women and touching those with fever. So these weren't instructions that God gave, but these were Jewish traditions at the time of Jesus. And so this story is actually another example of someone who was unclean, who shouldn't be able to approach God, and who in these stories is approached by God with us, Emmanuel, who makes them clean. And finally, in verses 16 and 17, we zoom out and we get to see Jesus healing many demon-possessed, those with spirits, and many sick people. And so if those first three are the small individual pictures, here we zoom out and we see it at a larger scale. And the reason Matthew includes this is because he wants to make an interpretive comment in verse 17. And to do that, he turns to Isaiah 53, the famous suffering servant song, and it would be worth reading this whole chapter of Isaiah to get some context, because when New Testament authors quote the Old Testament like this, it's not just this verse. They want you to upload that whole passage and think about it. And what's interesting about this quote from Isaiah is the way that Matthew translates it in his gospel. The commentators tell us is in a very literal sense. And so even in Matthew's day, teachers of the law understood this passage in a redemptive, metaphorical sense, in which the Messiah took sins upon himself. But the way that Matthew translates it is very literal. And so when he talks about infirmities and diseases, he's not necessarily talking about sin or spiritual things, but he's making it very physical. And so the question is, well, why does he do that? How is this linking to what we've seen before? Well, the question, I suppose, that Matthew thinks we might be asking is, where does this sickness, this ritual uncleanness that we've seen in the previous stories, well, how does Jesus have the authority or the ability to get rid of it? Where does it go? And so the point he makes in verse 17 is actually all of the sickness, this infirmity, and this disease is going onto Jesus. He's like a sponge that sucks it all up. And to one extent, this remains a mystery for us to ponder as we work through Matthew's Gospel, but it will become something that we will see in more detail as we see Jesus take not only the sins of the world, but the evil, the sickness, disease onto himself to deal with it once and for all on the cross. So what do we want people to walk away with? Well, here are three thoughts. One, we want them to be challenged, particularly with Jesus' teaching point in verses 11 and 12, about whether they are included or excluded in the kingdom. These stories are beautiful examples of people who we might think would be excluded from God's presence and his kingdom, who are in fact included. And at the same time, Jesus uses this as an example and a warning to those who think they are included, that they need to make sure that they are in fact included, and that on that final day they won't be excluded. Secondly, this is a challenge to us to get our understanding of God and our sin right. And the group guide tries to draw this out a bit. But we often say things like a holy God cannot stand or tolerate sin, which is something of a half-truth. And so it's true that God will not let our sin stand, but it's not true to say that God can't enter into the presence of our sin, or even that we in our sinful state can't enter into his presence, because in these stories we see God with us, the same God who demanded ritual purity for the Israelites to approach him, entering into that uncleanness and making people clean. And so the question there is to understand, well, what are the implications for that? What does it tell us about God? Or what does it tell us is possible with our sin and our uncleanness? Is there any sin that means that we cannot come to God in repentance? Is there any uncleanness which means that God cannot or can no longer make us clean? And so there's a real joy in knowing that God is able to make us clean. And finally, we should consider the nature of Jesus' death on the cross, that interpretive comment that Matthew makes, where Jesus takes all that grit and dirt and the sin of our world onto himself, and that should lead us to gratitude.